Well, let's get more analysis. We can speak now to Dr. Sajjan Gohel, who is the International Security Director at the Asia Pacific Foundation and a visiting teacher at the London School of Economics. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. There are some people in Washington who are concerned looking at the Indian Prime Minister there in China, looking like perhaps he's entering the orbit of China and Russia and pivoting away somewhat from the United States. What do you say to that?
Well, there has been this concern that as trade talks between the United States and India were reaching an impasse, that the fact that the Trump administration opted to go public in its social media commentary about that seemed to not necessarily produce the desired results. Now, the fact that the U.S. adopts that approach is not necessarily new with the Trump administration. They did it during the first term. It's definitely been amplified more. In many ways, it's a strategy, but it's not necessarily producing the desired results, because I think for India, like with China, these are countries that prefer to do the negotiating behind closed doors rather than airing it openly. Now, Prime Minister Modi was most probably likely going to Tianjin for the SCO summit in any case, but it's had more significance as a result of this impasse between the US and India.
Okay, would you say tariffs are the only issue, or are there other irritants, would you say, in the relationship between New Delhi and Washington right now?
Well, if you look at the fact that since Bill Clinton went to India just before his second term ended, there was this massive strategic pivot towards India by various U.S. administrations across the political divide. So George W. Bush, Barack Obama, President Trump himself during his first term, and then President Biden, all of them sought this pivot to India to do with the Indo-Pacific strategy, of which India was a key element. What seems to have perhaps changed now is that under the second Trump administration, they are focusing on trade. That seems to be the primary aspect, perhaps even more important for them than the Indo-Pacific aspect. And that is where tensions have emerged, especially to do with tariffs and also the aspect about India purchasing Russian oil. It's very interesting that just a few hours ago, President Trump actually put out a message on his Truth Social talking about that his frustration was that India wasn't buying enough American oil as opposed to Russian oil. And I think that's what it ultimately stems for. The Russia aspect seems to be a misnomer. It's more about the bilateral trade that the U.S., especially the Trump administration, wants from India. But perhaps the way they're going about it isn't necessarily going to produce the desired results.
And do you think Prime Minister Modi, sitting there in China at that event, listening to a speech by the President of China in which President Xi Jinping talked about the chaotic global international situation, he also talked about the bullying antics of certain countries, how much of a chord do you think that will have struck with him?
Well, the fact of the matter is that India and China have had tensions, especially over the border. They have 3 points of contention in their border dispute. Each one has on occasions turned into a small conflict, the last one being during the pandemic in 2020. And what you saw was a cold frostiness between both countries, where people-to-people ties was cut, direct flights was stopped. Trade was also impacted. India banned social media from China like TikTok. What is perhaps now happening is the early steps to seeing if that relationship can improve. Those fault lines that still exist on the border will remain. I think for China, they would naturally want India to move away from that Indo-Pacific pivot that the U.S. has been wanting. And it's kind of interesting that we've already seen the U.S. reacting to Prime Minister Modi's trip to China. The U.S. Embassy in India actually put out a tweet on X with the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that the India-U.S. relationship is one of the most important. So you're seeing a kind of a varied commentary by the Trump administration, and it'll be interesting what more comes out of this in the coming days.
So from what you're saying, it sounds as though perhaps Prime Minister Modi's calculation was right, and appearing in pictures, holding hands, I should add, with the president of Russia, has somehow sent a message to Washington, and it seems to have been a message that's received and understood. Is that roughly what you're saying?
Well, look, the optics are obviously going to be important in conveying a message. And keep in mind that India has a long-standing relationship with Russia that hasn't begun just during or before the Ukraine war. This is going back generations. When Russia, in its previous guise as the Soviet Union, there was a strategic relationship between Russia and India. India continues to purchase a huge amount of defense equipment from Russia. So that aspect hasn't necessarily changed. It's perhaps got, again, more focus because of the tensions with the US. China and Russia definitely want India to move further away from that pivot that the US has been advocating. And I think it's up to the US now to try and resolve some of the tensions that have emerged, because the fact is that India is being penalized for purchasing Russian oil, which the Biden administration in the first place had encouraged India to do because it put a price cap on it. And that wasn't seen as a violation, but it actually was designed as an attempt to prevent oil prices from rising.
You haven't mentioned the tensions between India and Pakistan, and so I'll bring that into the conversation now, because at the time, and we're talking now 3-4 months ago, President Trump claimed quite a lot of credit for having brokered a solution to that standoff between India and Pakistan. I'm just wondering how you think that crisis has changed the dynamic in relations between New Delhi and this second Trump administration.
Well, the Pahalgam terrorist attack that occurred in Indian-administered Kashmir definitely triggered a problem and a crisis, because India then reacted by targeting terrorist camps in Pakistan belonging to the Lashkar-e-Toiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed, and we then saw tit-for-tat strikes from both countries. Now, there has been huge debate about the role that the Trump administration played in this. Pakistan is giving the U.S. credit for reducing tensions. India is not. India believes that it was a bilateral dialogue between both India and Pakistan that resolved this. Pakistan nominated President Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. India hasn't done the same thing. Now, we've also seen that as a result of that, Pakistan has entered into trade ties with the U.S. over oil exploration, which a lot of people are skeptical about because they've looked at that oil off the coast of Balochistan and in the past, and it's never been found. Natural rare earth minerals also, again, countries like China have spent a huge amount of time trying to find that in Pakistan to no avail. So there has been trade ties and improvements between Pakistan and the United States, but the fine print is yet to establish whether there's anything substantial that will come out of it. India, of course, remains to be resolved between the U.S. in terms of trade. There is perhaps hope that there still remains a window for both countries to resolve this situation. But what I think doesn't help is when you have people tied to the Trump administration like Peter Navarro going on the media, making public criticisms, making comments that are viewed as very incendiary inside India. For example, Peter Navarro said very recently that the oil that India is buying is only benefiting Brahmins. Now, that is a caste-based remark that is also difficult to understand, because Prime Minister Modi is not a Brahmin, and nor are any of the senior members of the Indian government. So it's unclear who he's referring to, but it's nevertheless going to add an unnecessarily spoke to what has become a protracted situation between both countries.
I know you're not in India right now, but what is your sort of overall opinion of how the Indian public view the Trump administration? Because an opinion poll back in January suggested that the Indian public were amongst the most optimistic people in the world with regards to the return to the White House of President Donald Trump. How do you think they feel now?
Well, it's a good question. You are right that Trump was viewed favorably in India in the start of this year, and there was bonhominy between both Prime Minister Modi and President Trump during Trump's first term. But things seem to have changed. I think there has been a shock in India as to how the U.S. has reacted to the impasse in trade negotiations. I don't think it's necessarily that it's turned hostile. I think there's more confusion as to what's occurred. And the thing is that with the Trump administration, they can play what is, I guess, a page out of the art of the deal of President Trump's tactics for negotiating. And it can then lead from highs to lows and back and forth. So if this gets resolved soon, then I think opinions may well change again. But we'll have to watch this space.
Okay, so were you to give advice to the Trump administration on how to rectify the situation with India, bearing in mind those pictures we've seen from China, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi is very welcome at the table with Presidents Xi and Putin, what would your advice be?
I think the starting point is that have those direct conversations with Prime Minister Modi, and also try and aim to do it off social media and off the gaze of the media itself, and do it privately. And perhaps then actual progress can probably be attained.
So I'm detecting from you there is an irritation in Delhi, or at least your perception is there's an irritation in Delhi at the public nature in which diplomacy is being carried out by this administration. Is that what you're saying?
Well, look, I can't speak for another country or another government as to how they look at it. But if you, as a neutral observer, if you look at the optics of how things have transpired in the last couple of months, it has led to uncertainty in the diplomatic ties. It's created a sense of frustration, I think, from both sides as to what is required. Keep in mind that India's 50% tariffs are on par with a country like Brazil. President Lula of Brazil does not have a good personal relationship with President Trump. President Trump preferred his predecessor, former President Bolsonaro. In the case of India, there is that good relationship that has existed between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. They haven't publicly criticized each other even during this crisis. So there still remains that possibility to resolve this. But of course, the longer this drags on, the more uncertain those ties will actually be. And we don't know also what is the U.S. focus when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. That has very much gone up in the air. So if you factor in things like the Quad, which is the U.S., India, Australia, and Japan, this is the four nations that are meant to be dealing with the Indo-Pacific challenges. The future of the Quad is also being questioned. And then there's a Quad Leaders Summit that is supposed to be in India later this year. Will President Trump go to that? All these things are going to be important to ascertain.
Okay, well, we really appreciate your analysis. As ever, a pleasure talking to you. Dr. Sajjan Gohel, thank you for your time, sir.
My pleasure.